The silence hit Laramie's diner like a physical thing, sudden and total, cutting through the clatter of forks and the morning weather report droning from the corner TV. It started with the dog. The German Shepherd had been standing rigid at his handler's left heel, motionless as carved stone, the kind of disciplined stillness that made grown men uneasy. His tactical harness read "Do Not Pet," working dog in block letters. In the 3 minutes since Major General Silas Morrow had walked through the door, the animal had not blinked, had not sniffed, had not so much as shifted his weight. Then he moved. No command, no signal. The leash went slack in the general's hand as Halo took 2 measured steps away from his handler's side. Something he had never done in 6 years of active service and 8 months of retirement. The general's arm shot out to catch the lead, but he was a half-second too slow. Every person in the diner watched the retired military working dog walk with slow, deliberate certainty toward the corner booth, toward the young woman in the faded army hoodie who had been doing her level best to disappear into the cracked vinyl seat. What happened next made a retired county judge spill his coffee, made a table of off-duty MPs go completely still, and made Derek Sperling, who had been laughing loudly at his own story 3 seconds prior, fall silent for the first time all morning. Nobody in Laramie's diner would forget what they saw, and nobody, least of all the young woman herself, could have explained it. Romy Falk had arrived at the diner at 6:47 that morning, because the alternative was sitting alone in her apartment, staring at the letter from the VA Regional Administration that she'd already read 11 times. She was 29 years old and looked, at first glance, like someone the world had used hard and put away without much care. There was a compression brace visible below the hem of her jeans, graphite gray, fitted from ankle to mid-thigh. And she walked with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who had learned to negotiate every surface like a potential obstacle. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight, wore no makeup, and had the kind of eyes that tracked the room without appearing to. Old habit, the kind you didn't lose. She ordered black coffee and a side of wheat toast she hadn't touched. The letter sat folded in the front pocket of her hoodie, and she could feel the corner of it pressing against her ribs. The Fort Hood VA Satellite Annex was closing, effective in 30 days. Romy was the benefits intake coordinator there, had been for 2 years, since she'd been medically separated from the Army after her 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. The IED that had shredded the lateral ligament and cracked 2 vertebrae in her lower spine had ended her career as a combat medic, but it hadn't ended her need to be useful. The Satellite Annex processed benefits claims for over 400 veterans in the Killeen area, men and women who couldn't easily make the hour drive to the main center in Waco. It wasn't glamorous work. It was the right work. She showed up at 7 every morning and she did it. Or she had, until Derek Sperling had decided the land the annex sat on was worth considerably more than the veterans it served. Sperling arrived at Laramie's at 7:15, loud and cheerful, trailing 2 of his regional administrators like obedient satellites. He was the director of Central Texas VA Operations, a title that had, in the past 18 months, apparently convinced him that he was the most important person in any room he entered. He wore pressed khakis and a fleece vest with the VA logo embroidered on the chest, and he had the politician's habit of making eye contact with everyone except the people he was talking about. He saw Romy in the corner booth and changed course. Miss Falk. He stopped beside her table, not sitting, not asking, just looming. Thought that was you. Imagine running into you here. Mr. Sperling. Her voice was flat. She didn't look up from her coffee mug. Listen, I'm glad we have a chance to chat informally. The transition plan I sent over is very generous. Waco will absorb all the active cases. 412 cases, Romy said quietly. 17 of them are post-9/11 veterans with TBI claims that are mid-appeal. 3 are World War. 2 survivors in assisted living facilities who cannot travel. The Waco Center is understaffed by 30%. She looked up at him then, her eyes steady. It is not a transition, it is an abandonment. Something shifted in Sperling's expression, not guilt, but the flicker of irritation that crosses a man's face when someone who is supposed to accept a situation starts using facts instead. Behind him, his two administrators suddenly found reasons to look at their phones. "The budget realities," he began. "The budget realities," Romy said, keeping her voice low, "and even include a $2.3 million allocation from the Killeen City Council to Pacific Rim Development Partners for a feasibility study on a mixed-use commercial complex on the block that the annex currently occupies." Sperling's jaw tightened. He glanced around the diner, calculating who might be listening. Several people were. "That decision," he said, each word precise and cold, "has nothing to do with you. And frankly, the annex doesn't need a benefits coordinator anymore. It needs to be decommissioned efficiently. If you can't support that process, there are severance options that. I'll tell you what she needs." A new voice cut across the diner, and it carried the particular quality of a voice that had spent decades issuing commands in conditions where being heard meant someone lived or died. Deep, unhurried, and absolute. The room turned. Major General Silas Morrow was not a man who required context. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and a face so thoroughly weathered by sun and hard country that it looked like topographic terrain. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a plain navy jacket, but the posture was unmistakable, the kind of straight-backed stillness that belonged to men who had commanded thousands of others in places that didn't make the news. A silver star and a combat infantryman badge were pinned to the lapel of his jacket, old ribbons, real ones. At his left side, on a now slack leash, was the German Shepherd. Halo was enormous, close to 90 pounds, all controlled muscle and trained attention, with a coat the color of charcoal and tan. He wore a tactical vest clipped tight across his chest. His ears rotated forward as he scanned the room, and his eyes, dark amber and wholly without sentiment, moved with systematic efficiency. Morrow had walked through the door 2 minutes earlier. He had paused just inside the entrance, the way all trained people did, taking inventory, building the map of the room. He had seen Sperling. He had seen the men with him. He had seen Romy Falk in the corner booth, her hands wrapped around a mug, her jaw set at the particular angle of a person absorbing something painful without letting it show. He had walked toward her without hesitation. Now he stood 3 feet from Sperling and did not acknowledge the man at all. "Ma'am," the general said, his attention on Romy. "Mind if I sit down?" Derek Sperling blinked. "General, I'm sorry, we were in the middle of a..." "Were you?" Morrow said without looking at him. A beat of silence. Sperling's two administrators developed a sudden mutual interest in the pastry display by the register. Romy stared up at the general. She had no idea who he was. The medals meant something, and the dog meant something. But her mind was mostly occupied by the baffling fact that this man had walked past the table with the county commissioner, past the table with 3 officers in uniform, and come directly to her. "Yes," she said. "Of course, sir." Morrow sat. He signaled to the waitress for coffee, and then Halo broke formation. It happened fast, and it happened slowly, the way significant things always do. The leash went soft. Morrow reached for it and missed by inches. The dog moved with quiet intentionality. Not lunging, not anxious, but deliberate, the way a search animal moves when it has found what it has been looking for. He walked the 7 feet to Romy's side of the booth and lowered his broad, heavy head into her lap. Romy's hands came up instinctively. She froze with them inches above the dog's ears, afraid to touch an animal she didn't know. Halo pressed his head harder into her lap. A low sound came from his throat. Not a growl, not a warning. Something that landed somewhere between a whine and a sigh. His tail made one slow arc and came to rest against the dino floor. Morrow sat very still. The lines of his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with authority or command. He was watching his dog the way a person watches something they haven't seen before and aren't sure they're reading correctly. "He's never done that," the general said, low and private, as if telling it to himself. "In 6 years. He has never broken heel without a command." Romy looked down at the dog. Up close, she could see a faint scar along the edge of Halo's muzzle. Old, well-healed. a seam of pale skin where the fur had grown back thinner. She felt her throat tighten for a reason she couldn't immediately name. "He's been deployed," she said. It wasn't a question. 3 tours: Kandahar, Mosul, and the Paktia Valley. Morrow paused. He served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, Task Force Wolverine. He watched her face as he said it, watched for the recognition. Romy went white. The diner sounds retreated, the clinking silverware, the muffled television, the low murmur of conversations. All of it moved to a distance, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. She was aware of her own pulse, suddenly loud and irregular. "When?" she asked. The word came out thin. "September. 4 years ago." Morrow reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a photograph on the table between them. It was a print, not a phone shot. Someone had taken the time to develop it, which told her it mattered. 2 soldiers, kneeling in the dirt beside the German Shepherd. One of them was younger, 22 or 23, grinning at the camera. He had a Ranger tab on his shoulder. Romy's hand moved toward the photograph and stopped. She knew the boy in the picture, not his name. She had never learned his name. There hadn't been time, and afterward there had been too much else. But she knew his face. She knew the wound. She knew exactly which hand she had used to seal the sucking chest wound and how many seconds she'd had to get the needle decompression right before the left lung finished collapsing. She knew the sound he had made when he finally pulled a full breath. She knew that she had been singing something under her breath while she worked. She still couldn't remember what, because the noise helped her hands stay steady. She had been 25 years old, 3 months into her 3rd deployment, and it had been the 14th time she had done something like that, and it had gone right, and 2 hours later her convoy had hit the IED and she had woken up in Landstuhl with her knee rebuilt and 2 missing weeks. She had never found out if he lived. "His name is Corporal Tate Finlay," Morrow said quietly. "He was 22 years old that afternoon. He's 31 now. He is a firefighter in Bozeman, Montana. He has a daughter. Her name is Ellie, and she turned 2 in April." Morrow's voice was steady, but his hands, flat on the table between them, were not. "Tate is my nephew. My brother's youngest son. He spent 3 years believing you died in that convoy. We all did. The Army listed your medevac under a different unit designation because of a documentation error, and by the time the record was corrected, you'd been transferred and separated, and the trail went cold." Romy pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose and breathed through it. "I kept looking," Morrow said. "For 2 years after I retired, I kept looking. It took formal records requests through the Inspector General's office and a retired JAG officer who owed me a favor to finally pull the correct field medical logs from that day." He paused. "Hallow was in the vehicle 12 feet away when you worked on Tate. He saw everything. He has been carrying you with him since that afternoon in the Paktia Valley. He didn't know what to do with it until right now." Romy looked down at Halo. The dog had not moved. His weight in her lap was considerable and specific, like something ballasted against the possibility of her floating away. She let her hand settle finally on the back of his neck, fingers pressing gently into the coarse fur, and felt the shiver that moved through the animal at the contact. She had not cried once in the 2 years since she'd come home. Not at the physical therapy appointments, not at the medical separation hearing, not at the moment she had understood the permanence of the brace and the careful walk and the career that would never look the way she'd planned. She had filed it away in the place. She filed other irreducible things and kept moving. She cried now, quietly, without drama, tears dropping straight down onto the tactical vest of a retired military working dog who pressed into her with his full 90 pounds, like he was trying to hold her in places. Morrow placed a folded handkerchief on the table between them and said nothing. He let her have the moment. The diner around them had gone to church quiet, every person in it holding still as if they understood instinctively that something real was happening, and movement would break it. After a while, Romy wiped her face and looked at the general. "He doesn't know what's happening to the clinic," she said. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She'd thought she'd processed that part. 400 veterans. They're going to lose their only local intake office, so a developer can build condominiums on federal land. Tell me all of it. She exhaled slowly. When I separated, I went looking for work that kept me near the mission. The satellite annex isn't surgery, but it's veterans in a system that keeps losing them in the paperwork. I know how to move a file faster, flag a claim that needs urgent review, make sure someone whose hands shake too badly to fill out a form gets through the process without being denied on a technicality. She looked down at her hands. Sperling's been running a slow defunding operation on the annex for 18 months. Budget cuts here, position eliminations there. The city council quietly rezoned the adjacent parcels 6 weeks ago. The commercial development deal was signed last Tuesday. The closure is just the last step, making it official. Morrow's expression did something architecturally significant. The lines of it reorganized around a different structure entirely, one that had nothing gentle in it. The deed on the annex property, she continued. It was built with a federal VA grant in 2003. There's a covenant. It specifies usage for veteran healthcare services in perpetuity. Sperling's lawyers are claiming the language is ambiguous. Morrow was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he reached for his phone. "Miss Falk," he said, already dialing. "Stay here." The Killeen VA Regional Board convened at noon in the conference room of the Regional Administrative Building. It was a beige room with acoustic ceiling tiles and a projector screen at one end, and Derek Sperling had arranged everything to look like conclusion rather than process. The closure documents were printed, collated, and stacked at each seat. The rezoning approval, the City Council, was displayed on a standing board near the door. A representative from Pacific Rim Development Partners sat at the far corner of the table, with the air of a man who has already mentally spent his commission. The board chair had just called the meeting to order when the conference room door opened. It did not open the way conference room doors usually opened. Silas Morrow was in full dress uniform. The meeting had given him 45 minutes, which had been enough. His medals caught the fluorescent light. Behind him, walking with her back straight and her jaw set, came Romy Falk, the compression brace visible below her dress slacks, her eyes moving across the room with the same efficient inventory she'd learned to run in the field. Beside her, Halo moved in perfect disciplined silence, amber eyes scanning the table with the impartiality of a sentry. In the doorway, holding a stack of legal documents thick enough to use as a doorstop, stood a man in a gray suit whom no one recognized, but whom everyone in the room instinctively understood. "I have a matter of federal jurisdiction," Morrow said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'll need 10 minutes. Sperling stood up fast enough that his chair scraped. "General Morrow, this is a closed board session. You cannot simply—" "The deed covenant on the annex property," Morrow said, continuing as though Sperling had not spoken, directing his words to the board chair, "was executed under Federal Statute 38 CFR Part 17 and contains an in perpetuity clause restricting the property to veteran health services use. That clause was not extinguished by the 2019 administrative review that Mr. Sperling's office cited as precedent. It wasn't extinguished because that review applied to a different property designation entirely and was therefore inapplicable." He nodded at the man in the gray suit, who stepped forward and placed the document stack in front of the board chair with the care of someone setting down something that could not be argued with. "Those are federal injunctions issued this morning by the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas, freezing all rezoning action on the annex property pending a full federal audit." The development representative's ease evaporated entirely. Sperling's face moved through several colors. Furthermore, Morrow said, his gaze traveling the length of the table to settle on Sperling with the specific attention of a man who does not waste it. "The Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General has opened a preliminary inquiry into the procurement process by which Pacific Rim Development Partners was identified as the city's commercial development allocation. That inquiry was requested this morning by a retired general officer with standing to make the request. That general officer is me." A beat of silence. "You're welcome to stay for the rest of this meeting, Mr. Sperling, but I would recommend getting your attorneys on the phone. Sperling grabbed his portfolio. He did not say anything. He left the room, and the development representative followed 30 seconds later, less gracefully, and the door swung shut behind them both, with a sound that felt like punctuation. The board chair looked at the injunctions. She looked at Morrow. She looked at the injunctions again. "General," she said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" Morrow turned to face the room. The fury that had been in his face when he'd looked at Sperling was gone, replaced by something that had the quality of a plan. Concrete, specific, and built for longevity. "The annex doesn't close," he said. "It expands. There is a $3.1 million federal grant available through the VA's Adaptive Sports and Therapeutic Programs Initiative that the Central Texas regions has never applied for. I intend to see that application filed within the week. Additionally, 2 private defense contractors with active veteran workforce programs have agreed to fund a matched renovation package contingent on the facility's protection." He paused. "We will build the finest veteran benefits and therapeutic recovery center between Dallas and El Paso on that site, and we will staff it properly." He crossed to where Romy stood near the wall. He didn't make a show of it. He simply walked to her and stopped and looked at her the way a man looks at someone whose record he has read and whose judgment he has decided to trust. "What I need right now," he said, keeping his voice low, just for her, "is someone who can run the medical operations side. Someone who understands what these veterans are walking in with, what they need from a system that has lost the habit of seeing them, and what it looks like from inside a medevac flight when everything is going wrong. And the only thing standing between a soldier and the end of his story is a medic who knows what she is doing." He didn't look at her leg. He didn't avoid it either. He just looked at her face, direct and without ceremony. "You kept my nephew's heart beating in the Pactia Valley until the helicopter arrived. I am asking you to do the same thing for 400 men and women who are fighting a different kind of battle. Will you take the position?" Romy looked at the stack of federal injunctions on the table. She looked at the empty chair where Sperling had been sitting. She looked at Halo, who was watching her with the unhurried certainty of an animal who had already made his decision. "Yes," she said. Her voice was clear and did not waver. "It would be the honor of my life." Morrow nodded once, the way men nod when a thing is settled and no further words are necessary. "One more thing." He reached down and unclipped Halo's leash from the tactical vest. He placed the loop of it in Romy's hand, closing her fingers around the webbing with the deliberateness of a formal transfer. "He retired 8 months ago. He has been patient. I think he's been waiting for the right place." He stepped back. "He's yours if you'll have him." Halo did not wait for a second invitation. He stepped forward and pressed his flank against Romy's leg. The braced one. The one that ached in cold weather and took the stairs last and never quite let her forget the convoy and the 2 missing weeks and everything that came after. And he stood there solidly, like something that had decided to be useful. Romy held the leash with both hands. She didn't cry this time. She breathed. 14 months later, the Fort Hood Veteran Support and Recovery Center opened its doors at 7 in the morning, and Romy Falk was the first one inside. She walked the corridor with Halo beside her, not pressed against her leg anymore, but close, the way partners walk when they no longer need to check on each other constantly. He wore a service vest now, burgundy with white lettering, and he moved with the particular calm authority of an animal who understood his job and found it worthy of his full attention. The center smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, and faintly of the coffee already brewing in the intake waiting room. The walls held photographs, not stock images of landscapes, but real ones. Veterans who had processed their claims through the old annex, who had agreed to have their pictures taken and hung here so that the next person through the door would see a face instead of a case number. Rompy stopped at the main desk and checked the day's schedule. 43 intake appointments. 3 emergency appeals that needed same-day flag review. A group session with 7 post-9/11 veterans starting at 10. Standard Tuesday. She had been practicing again for 6 months. Not surgery, not the field, but therapeutic consultation and claims advocacy, which turned out to be its own form of triage. She had learned to run the center the way she'd learned to run a forward operating base medical station. With full knowledge of every resource, constant attention to the most critical cases, and the clear-eyed understanding that paperwork could kill a person just as surely as a wound if nobody was watching the clock. Tate Finlay had come through in March with his daughter in tow. He had stood in the doorway of her office for a long moment before he said anything, and then he said, "Thank you," which was the wrong word and also the only word. And neither of them tried to find a better one. Halo had climbed half into the man's lap on the small office couch and stayed there for 20 minutes while Ellie Finlay, almost 3 years old, with opinions about everything, cataloged the supply closet with systematic toddler intensity. General Morrow drove down from Fort Hood the first Wednesday of every month to review the operational reports. He drank bad coffee without complaint, asked specific questions, and never once suggested that anything was running incorrectly, which Romy had come to understand was his version of high praise. Outside, through the long east-facing windows, the Texas sun was coming up hard and flat and gold over the flat country, burning the overnight chill off the parking lot in slow curls of mist. The flag above the entrance moved in the early wind. Halo sat beside Romy's chair, watching the light change. His tail moved in one slow arc, not excitement, not urgency. Just the quiet, steady rhythm of a creature at rest in the right place, at the right time, beside the right person. Romy put her hand on the back of his neck, where the fur was coarsest. The first appointment would arrive in 12 minutes. She was ready.